Welcome to another episode of Shane Plays Geek Talk. Thanks so much for pressing play. This week we're going to be talking with author Jim Breyfogle about his thrilling stories of the swashbuckling fantasy duo Mongoose and Meerkat. We'll also be talking about adventure fiction as opposed to quote-unquote pulp fiction. And what exactly does pulp mean while we're at it? Who is Jim's number one favorite writer from the past? My dirty little secret when it comes to Robert E. Howard's fiction. Robert A. Heinlein was both, or Heinlein, however you want to say it, was both amazing and sketchy. Fair witnesses are cool. The Odyssey Writing Workshop. Was Arthur C. Clarke a better plotter or a better writer? And also some love for CIRSOVA Magazine and its publisher, Alex, a.k.a. P. Alexander, who longtime listeners of the show will know that I've got a good advertising relationship with CIRSOVA and they do great work. Thanks again for listening. Really appreciate it. And now, on with the show.
Shall we play a game?
Why, yes. I believe we shall.
Oh, I got a live one here.
Getting geeky all up in your podcast, it's Shane Plays Geek Talk, a journey into the things we love. I'm your host, Shane Stacks. Thanks so much for pressing play. As always, delighted to have you. As I always like to remind folks at the beginning of an episode, it's Shane Plays or Shane Plays Geek Talk, but that doesn't mean it's just about games. It's when I play. It's when I geek out. I might talk about games, or I might talk about comic books, or I might talk about TV or movies, or we've had chip tunes. We've had all kinds of stuff on here. So if I feel like it's geeky, it goes. And this week we're going to be talking about thrilling adventure fiction, which we occasionally talk about on the show. I might call it pulp, but that's not really exactly what it is. Longtime listeners will know that I have an ongoing friendship and advertising relationship with CIRSOVA Magazine. That's CIRSOVA Magazine, run by Alex P. And I believe he describes it as thrilling adventure. I kind of say it's keeping the pulp fiction torch alive. But like I said, it's more than just pulp, even though I love pulp, but it's that adventure, that thrilling adventure fiction in the vein of, it might be swords and sorcery, or it might be, something more Lovecraftian or horror or whatever. But one of the breakout writers and ongoing set of stories from CIRSOVA is Mongoose and Meerkat, written by Jim Breyfogle. So I've got Jim on the show today, and not only are we going to be talking about what's cool about Mongoose and Meerkat in general, and CIRSOVA and that style of fiction and his influences and how he got into writing and all that, but there's also a Kickstarter going on right now to collect the second volume of Mongoose and Meerkat stories from CIRSOVA. So we'll be talking about that too. But with no further ado, welcome to Shane Plays, Jim. How the heck are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me on here. It's a pleasure, and I welcome the opportunity.
Well, cool, man. Glad to have you. Alex reached out, and he told me about the Kickstarter going on, and that, asked me if I want to talk to you, and I thought it was a great idea. So, just really glad to have you. I'm eager to learn more. I know I've seen your work in CIRSOVA many more than one time. So I know you've got an ongoing relationship with CIRSOVA Magazine. So, before we get into Mongoose and Meerkat, which is, how would you describe that as fantasy? What is your description of the Mongoose and Meerkat?
Yeah, I'd start off by kind of describing it as second world fantasy, which is, fantasy fiction in a world that's not our own. Because it's an ongoing series of stories, I don't want to say it's kind of your stock fantasy medieval sort of thing, because there's a lot of opportunity over the course of all the stories to sort of vary things up. So some of the stories have a little bit of a horror element, and some of them have a little bit of mystery element, and some of them have a little bit of steampunk element, and some of them actually are kind of stock fantasy. So there's what I think of as kind of a good variety of subgenres within that fantasy.
There's one of the, I think this might be from the current Kickstarter, and folks, you can go to shaneplays.com and there'll be show notes for today's episode. And one of the links in there will be for the Kickstarter, but you can also, search for CIRSOVA, CIRSOVA, CIRSOVA Magazine, or just search for Mongoose and Meerkat. And it's like it sounds, mongoose, like Ricky Tikki Tavi, the mongoose, or Meerkat, the cute little, what Disney character is it that's the meerkat? Is that, it's from The Lion King, isn't it?
Kuban,
yeah, so...
Yeah, that one.
they're just the cute creatures.
Timon.
But Mongoose and Meerkat, Timon, that was it. Yeah. So Mongoose and Meerkat are the nicknames of a man and woman adventuring duo. And I believe the description from the current Kickstarter, it says Jim Breyfogle is one of CIRSOVA Publishing's breakout stars. His swashbuckling duo, Mongoose and Meerkat, have become one of CIRSOVA Magazine's most popular features. CIRSOVA Publishing released the smash hit collection, Tales of the Mongoose and Meerkat Volume 1, Pursuit Without Asking, in 2020, and also your fairy tale romance, The Paths, is it Cormanor? Is that in 2021? Is that Cormanor? Okay. And then it goes on to say Jim began inventing stories to keep himself occupied during the school day, and later, as all good writers, created stories for the entertainment and delight of his children. He's a regular attendee of the World Fantasy Convention, and in 2010 was accepted to attend the prestigious Odyssey Writing Workshop. Since that time, Jim has been published in numerous magazines. So there's a little bit more of a description of Mongoose and Meerkat here that I'll hold until we get into that as the main topic. But tell us a little bit. Well, first I have a question for you. And I'm not trying to be, we were talking a little bit before we started recording that I purposefully, I'm not trying to get into negative debates or anything like that. So this is more of just an open-ended question without any intent behind it. I'm honestly curious. When I think of stuff like what CIRSOVA's doing, or Mongoose and Meerkat, or that type of fiction, I often describe it to people as pulp, and I do not mean that in any way as negative. To me, that's positive, and it encapsulates that feeling, or that it's kind of an instant shorthand so people can kind of understand. But I know that Alex with CIRSOVA is, putting a lot of time and energy into saying like thrilling adventure or adventure fantasy or something like that, which is fine. Again, I'm not saying that's wrong. But what are your personal feelings on the pulp? Like obviously if I take our Robert E. Howard from, I guess, the 30s or something like that, that's pulp, right? But, right. But fiction in the vein of that these days, like that's being published in CIRSOVA, or that you're publishing elsewhere, or that kind of swashbuckling, swords and sorcery or something. What do you think of the term pulp being applied to new fiction?
It sort of depends on what the person who's applying it means, which is, that gets into a really subjective area. It almost gets down to
Fair.
I don't know, because I don't know what the person means by it. Pulp in some ways can be very derogatory because it's sort of this mushy stuff that has no real form or function. And if you look at the heyday of what is called pulp fiction back in, the 50s and before, it was very much looked down upon. The people who were selling a lot of books never got bestseller status because those sales weren't even considered worth counting when you're discussing best-selling status. And even today, I get into discussions with people who genre fiction is all sort of lumped into the outgrowth of fantasy pulp fiction, and it's not literature. It's not good. It's, hold your nose and call it beach reading if you want to say it's something good, but it's just not worth it. And I look at that, and some of it is definitely that. Some of it is just brain candy. And there's nothing wrong with brain candy and beach reading. There's a time and a place for it, but there's also a time when I kind of get my hackles up and I say, if you don't like this sort of fantastic fiction, then why do you like Oscar Wilde? Oscar Wilde is a great writer, and he wrote A Picture of Dorian Gray, and what's that except fantasy fiction?
Right.
So, I think it's easy to sort of define the term the way you want it defined in how you're presenting it. When I was writing Mongoose and Meerkat, I'm not trying to write great literature here. It's not going to be something that gets measured with the most wonderful things that you read about in American Lit in 10th grade or anything like that. But I do think that the fantasy genre does provide a vehicle for something more meaningful than just the beach reading. And it's a little disingenuous to look down on fantasy fiction and just call it all pulp and brainless stuff that depends on, just, it's if it doesn't have magic, it doesn't have anything going for it, or science fiction. If it doesn't have fantastic technology, there's nothing in it. All great fiction is stories about people. And if your fantasy only has magic and not a good story with characters and how they interact and how that magic impacts them in a meaningful way, then you're going to have something that's, brain candy, if that. But if you can integrate it into something worthwhile that really tells an interesting story about people and things that are meaningful to them, then there's no reason that something that incorporates fantastic elements can't also be good writing and good literature.
So there's a lot of really interesting thoughts in there. First and foremost, it's what does somebody mean by pulp? I think that's totally fair enough. So I for me, it just means those really fun stories that have thrilling, bigger than life heroes, and that are just doing cool adventures that fire the imagination, and in some cases, pulp, as you say, can be looked upon dismissively, has gone on to lay patterns and archetypes for, today's fiction. So I certainly hold it in high regard because there was people out there writing stuff that may have been looked down on, but they cared about it tremendously. And it's gone on to, impact so many readers, and so much entertainment. Yeah.
And there's a lot of stuff that was looked down upon previously. And, when people circle back and revisit it, they're like, hey, maybe they didn't give this a fair chance. Maybe there's more to it than was originally thought. And some stuff, you can go to Tolkien because there's a lot of critique that says, this is just escapist literature. It's not even worth our reading because it has nothing to do with our lives. It's just trying to get out of what you're doing and pretend that you're somewhere else so that you can get away from whatever is going on in your own life. And Tolkien's response to that is, and so what? What's wrong with that? We go on vacations, don't we? Why shouldn't we have, like a reading vacation where you read something that takes place in another world that is entertaining for you and is not something that, necessarily is a downer like some of these, I don't want to pick on Dostoevsky or anything, but he's not the most cheerful guy to read. And sometimes if you read something that's just fun, there's nothing wrong with that.
No, I'm totally, yeah, I'm with you. Tolkien, if I'm reading something like Tolkien, I want to be transported away to where I can, I'm not trying to get heavy, but, you've got, the war going on in the Ukraine right now. That's heavy stuff, man. And it's hard to really think about, but, if you read The Lord of the Rings, you can kind of grapple with, good versus evil or just two, nations fighting or whatever. And safe is the wrong word, but in a way that doesn't have direct personal stakes to you. Like Star Trek, dealt with a lot of political issues and social issues, but it got your defenses down because it was just science fiction. It's just these aliens arguing or whatever, but they were grappling with real stuff. I'm not saying that Tolkien was trying to do that. I'm just saying that, escapism, for me anyway, definitely has a place in my entertainment. So,
right.
So let me, I'll tell you a dirty little secret of me and Pulp. I went, it wasn't until the past few years that I went and read all of the Conan from Robert E. Howard. And then I read all of the Solomon Kane. And now this is Robert E. Howard. So I'm not talking about other people coming along later and adding to the to the body of works with those characters. I actually liked Solomon Kane better than I did the Conan stuff. Not that I didn't like Conan, but I was surprised to find that I was more into the Solomon Kane than I was the Conan. And his Conan, as you know this, listeners may not, the Conan movie, Conan the Barbarian movie, is one of my favorite movies. I love that movie, but it doesn't really reflect the Conan stories. The Conan movie with, who was the guy in it a few years ago? I think it was the same guy that plays Aquaman now. What's his face?
Momoa? Jason.
Yeah. I think he played Conan in the more recent movie. That was actually more accurate to the pulp stories of Conan. But anyway, so do you have any favorite? Do you like? And I know pulp is more than just Robert E. Howard or some of these others, but do you have some influences from those older writers on what you do now?
So I have a hard time just sort of reaching into my pile of read books and pulling out stuff that I think is just like, my absolute favorite. If I were to do that, I actually think my number one favorite older writer, which is a little unfair because he wrote for a long time, but he only passed away, I think, 20 years ago or so. But I love Ray Bradbury.
Oh, yeah.
He when he's on, his writing is just beautiful. And if
it's poetic, it's prose, but it reads like Yeah, I was just, and we'll get back to Ray Bradbury here in a second. I love Ray Bradbury, and I agree with you. When he's good, it's prose, but it's very poetic. I read, oh God, I can't believe it. It's Sparrowhawk. Darn it. Land Sea. Oh, what is that? I can't believe I'm forgetting this. It's like one of the major works in fantasy.
Earthsea.
Hold on. Earthsea. Yeah. So Tales of Earthsea.
Ursula Le Guin.
Yeah. That's the other writer that I've encountered that their prose is like poetry. I was like, it's like, this is like just poetry on the page, even though it's prose. So, that's the only other writer that I've personally encountered that struck me that same way. But anyway, back to Ray Bradbury. Tell us about Ray Bradbury.
So, as you say, his prose is just so good. But one of the things that it really works for me is when he's, especially like in Dandelion Wine, which is a series of stories about a kid growing up in a small town in what is presumably the Midwest. And the fantasy elements are very light. They can be misconstrued. Things in our world which are actually magical when seen through a young boy's eyes. And his tone and everything is just so spot on. I mean, he reaches out and he just grabs summer through a boy's eyes and he brings it to the reader in a way that is amazingly evocative. And I'm like, man, I wish I could write like that. I mean, nobody can write like that except Ray Bradbury, but I wish I could.
Yeah, there's a little bit of that same sensibility in Something Wicked This Way Comes. It's a boy in the circus coming to town and all of that. But yeah, Ray Bradbury's, if people haven't read Ray Bradbury and they like science fiction and fantasy, he was one of those writers that he wasn't really just a fantasy writer or a science fiction. He wrote his own stuff and it had elements of both sometimes. But he was definitely a writer of the fantastic.
Absolutely. And it's great to read him. I mean, it does give you a sense of how things change because, humans are colonizing Mars and they're talking between houses and they pick up the phone and it still has wires.
Right.
And we haven't made it to Mars yet, but our phones don't have wires. You're just like, why did he put wires on his phones? Really? I mean, but it's still a good story.
Well, that was the paradigm he was in, right? The wireless hadn't really, because he was writing in like you said, he passed away about 20 years ago. he did a lot of his writing, the 30s, 40s, 50s, maybe 60s.
Yeah.
So and it's really interesting when you read somebody that was a futurist. They were by nature a futurist in their fiction. They were projecting things. It's really interesting when they get something so incredibly right next to something that seems so blazingly wrong with the advantage of hindsight. So it's they're just kind of doing their best, looking into the crystal ball or whatever. But no, I love Bradbury. Trying to think of if we're going to go into heavy hitters like that, of course, Heinlein. Philip K. Dick.
Although, Heinlein, you kind of got to get the early, Heinlein has a lot of stuff. I don't remember how many books he published, but it was like over 150 of them, and they're a little hit or miss. Some of them are really good, and some of them are kind of sketchy.
Like, do you mind giving an example?
Farnham's Freehold. There's one that's kind of sketchy.
I never read that one. I've read a lot of Heinlein, but I haven't read that one. Yeah.
Yeah, some of his early stuff is really cool because it's still a time when science fiction was, your uncle from the Air Force can come visit you, and then you can slap together a rocket in your garage. It's the way people were doing chemistry back then, but he was applying it to science fiction.
I remember. I can't remember the name of the book. I think it was targeted at like teen audience, young boys, young adult, but. Yeah. This guy and these three kids who are rocket enthusiasts, this guy shows up and they decide to build a rocket and go to the moon, and it's just like, they just build it and go to the moon.
and it's nothing. It's great. Yeah. And he often targeted his audience towards younger readers. He was a regular contributor to Boys Life magazine, which was the periodical, I think it still is the periodical for the Boy Scouts of America, of all things. But that was kind of his sweet spot, was hitting the young audience of probably between 10 and 14.
Well, speaking of the uncle, like the uncle showing up from the Air Force, I think I'm on a Heinlein Facebook page, and they put quotes from him about every day. And, he's really, I don't think I realized until retrospect, because he puts a lot of his own personal philosophy into his books. His characters will espouse his personal philosophy. And he's like your irascible, occasionally cranky uncle that you learn about a lot about dealing with people and how to approach life from. Maybe you don't always agree with all of it. But like, for one perfect example, I think it was Stranger in a Strange Land, which is, I think everybody should read Stranger in a Strange Land. That transcends just science fiction. I don't agree with all of his philosophy in it, but it's a very philosophical book on what it means to be human and how to interact with other humans. But there's a scene in there where Jubal Harshaw, who is a grumpy old guy who's also helps people and whatnot, like he calls some minor bureaucrat, or he's trying to get through to somebody, and some minor flunky gets on the phone, and he's like, he goes, I'm so and so, and I want to talk with whoever, and they're like, oh, you'll have to leave a message. He's like, I'm not leaving a message, and this is very important, and he this is incredibly important, here's my number, and he slams the phone down, and it works. Not that much later, like the person he needs calls back, because it creates uncertainty on the other end. Like, maybe we really need to talk to this person. So he saved himself hours of going through layers of functionaries to get to the main guy. And so you learn a lot about, I don't know, human nature or navigating red tape or just whatever. Yeah. Like he has his Jubal Harshaw character has a way of cutting through the noise and getting like directly to a problem. And he has this concept called a fair witness, which are these people that I was going to just bring that up. Yeah. Well, I'll let you do it then. Go ahead. Tell us about the fair witness.
So it's and it's been a while because the scene, and I can't even place it in the book. But I think it is Lazarus Long, who is demonstrating what the witness does and why they're so good and important, because they won't testify to anything that they can't absolutely testify to themselves. And they're in a swimming pool, and the person he is with is trying to figure out what this means. And he says, well, I have one here. And he calls out to the woman who is swimming and says, all right, I need you to testify. What is the color of the house on the hill? And she looks at the house and she says, this side is white.
Right. That's very clear. That's a very clear memory. Right.
And that one has always stuck with me because we assume because we see the side of the house that it's white, that our normal answer is that's a white house, but we don't really know if it's a white house. All we know is that one side of the house is white. And for me, my takeaway was, we shouldn't make assumptions and we should be careful of our words. And I think that's kind of a strong thing for Heinlein to include in what we were just talking about as, like pulp fiction.
That's kind of, we're not here to talk about Heinlein, so I'm about to get us off of him. But talking about the richness you can get out of quote unquote, just, sci-fi or fantasy or something, there's some really rich dynamics in there. But right, the side I can see as white is very powerful as a philosophy, right? To make sure that you don't make assumptions that can take things astray or get people in trouble. And I think that's actually from Stranger in a Strange Land, because Jubal Harshaw has 3 women that are his assistants, and one of them is a fair witness. The fair witness was this concept before video recorders were super prevalent and everybody could record something on their phone. You could hire a fair witness to go around with you. And then if you ended up in court, their testimony was considered ironclad. Like society respected their testimony probably more than a video, because today you can alter videos easily, So if they said it, it was as truthful as a human being could see or could be. And they would just follow around and they would observe everything. And even though you were paying them, whatever testimony they were going to give was the truth, even if it hurt you. They were there to observe as much of the truth of reality as could be observed. But yeah, to take that further, like the side I can see as white, I think that book about the boys going to the moon, there's actually a discussion in there about they were talking about the far side of the moon, and the older guy who's sort of mentoring them makes a point of saying, well, how do you know that there's a far side of the moon? Because, the moon orbits us in a geostationary, whatever you call it. It doesn't, the moon doesn't spin, right? So we only see one side of the moon. And he makes a big point of saying, they're like, well, there has to be another side of the moon, because he said, no, until you see it, you don't absolutely know beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is another side to the moon. So he's very rigidly philosophical like that, I guess I would put it. But anyway, let's get off Heinlein. Do you have any other influences that you want to mention? People that have had a huge impact on you, and you were talking about Bradbury. I got us over into Heinlein.
No, I for a while I was on a Heinlein kick. I haven't read any Heinlein for probably, 15 years or so, because I would go to all the used bookstores and I would buy these things. So I'd buy Heinlein, I'd buy Asimov, I'd buy Arthur Clarke, Bradbury, and it got to the point, even though Heinlein has written so many books, there are only so many of them that you can find. So I have probably 30 or 35 Heinleins, and I've read them all, and I haven't found anything since then. But so many things that some of them are good, some of them are not good. Of the older stuff, I like Heinlein. I like Bradbury. I like Asimov. I'm not a huge Clarke fan. I know it's a little bit of heresy, but I don't find his stories.
Yeah, thank you for being on the show. I'm going to go ahead and end it. I'm just joking. I'm give or take on Clarke. I remember reading up through, I think the 3000 whatever book in high school, and then years later I read was it 4000 where they find Frank Poole floating around frozen in space or something.
Yeah, I don't know.
Which actually, to me, that was the most interesting one. So, With the original 2001, you had two astronauts. You had Dave and Frank, and Hal kills Frank. Hal gets Frank out in space and abandons him in space or something like that. Well, I can't remember. I think it was the fourth book. I think it was 4,000 something. I don't know. Can't even remember. I'd have to look it up. They find Frank's body out in space and they're able to revive him with their advanced technology. And that one was actually very interesting. Probably the most interesting one other than 2001, because it's showing what Earth is like that far in the future, in Clark's view. And that one was very interesting. So
my dirty little secret confession on Clark is I haven't read Space Odyssey. I've picked up various and sundry other things, like Ghost of the Grand Banks and things like that. And the first one that I read, I was pretty disappointed in. And I'm like, I'll give him another shot. So I read, Green Hills of Earth? No, that's not him. Yeah, it is him. And it was okay. It had its moments. But Space Odyssey is supposed to be so good. And I've read 4 or 5 of his things now that I just didn't relate to, that I'm like, I don't want to ruin Space Odyssey. If I read it, I'm afraid that I'm going to be terribly disappointed because I haven't liked the other stuff that he's written. So I purposefully have not read that book.
Well, I think that, Space Odyssey, Clark is one of those people where his concepts are more interesting or better than his prose, if you know what I mean. Like, he comes up with amazing concepts, but actually sitting down and reading through his stuff, he never knocked me over like Asimov or Heinlein or, some of the other, some of the other writers you mentioned or other favorite writers I had, but I always thought his concepts were cool.
I'll back that 100%. If you read some of Clark's short stories, you read them and they're like, this isn't a story. This is a concept. And you might be able to turn it into a story, but it's not a story yet.
Well, I think that 2001: A Space Odyssey by Kubrick is one of those rare instances of the movie being much better than the book. Right? I mean, it does happen on occasion. Yeah. And
fair enough.
Kubrick took that and just did his own thing with it. I mean, it's, I'm one of those people that thinks the movie is a masterpiece. So, but it captures most of what, if not everything that was in the book, if I remember correctly. Anyway, moving on. I wanted to go back to Heinlein for a second. I sing Heinlein's praises a lot, but he also has some stuff that I'm like, what are you talking about, dude? I don't know if you read Time Enough for Love, but content warning, whatever you want to call it. Like, this is, you can be like, whoa, okay, I really like this guy, but yikes. He spends several pages going through the mathematical and genetics of it would be okay to have sex with your mom. So I don't know if you remember that or not.
He does that in a couple places.
Yeah, he goes back and, like, one of his characters time travels or something and meets his own mom. And his character is massively attracted to his own mom and ends up having relations with his own mom. And there's pages of mathematical justification of why this is okay. Tossing aside. Go ahead.
When I was saying Farnham's Freehold, a little sketchy, same idea, but it's his daughter.
Yeah, see? Sorry, I was taking a drink and almost spit it out. That's crazy. See, I can't get behind that, right?
Yeah.
So that's where the strident philosophy of Heinlein and I depart from each other, because there are things that are not mathematical or not just on paper. I mean, there's some things that are just, you don't do, and no matter how much you want to argue that it's okay by the genetics of it or something like that, there's some things that are just fundamentally, let's don't go there. So moving on, how did you get into writing? And folks, we will talk about Mongoose and Meerkat, Jim's ongoing series that's proved quite popular in CIRSOVA Magazine and that is kickstarting the second volume right now, I think through the end of June, go to shaneplays.com, look for the show notes for this episode, or just search for Mongoose and Meerkat on Kickstarter. But tell us how you got into writing, Jim.
I don't know if I had a choice. I mean, some people, they just, it's what they do. And the thing that you were reading at the very beginning, that I started writing at an early age and kind of carried it on, it is true. I mean, I remember writing stories in middle school and before, and I'm glad I can't find them because I'm sure they weren't any good. But I do remember writing them, and I remember writing it like an ongoing thing that I would try and extend the story by a page a day until I just had reams and reams of writing. And it just continued. Especially, I told this story a couple times, and I pick on my poor chemistry teacher because he was really good, and I learned a lot of chemistry, but I didn't pay enough attention in class because I was always writing in the margins. You know, instead of having good chemistry notes, I would have sparse chemistry notes and extensive stories that I would try and develop.
Because that's where your brain that's where your brain went when you were bored, right? So yeah. Absolutely.
And so I just sort of kept doing it, and at that point in my life, I never really thought of being an author, with a capital A sort of thing. I just was writing stories because I enjoyed doing it. And I would probably, if God himself came down and sat beside me and said, Jim, you can write all the stories you want to, but you will never be published, I'd probably say, well, that sucks. But I'd still be writing stories because that's what I like to do. And I've been
speaking of God
fortunate.
himself, yeah, that reminds me of it. And this is not a religious podcast, but Paul said something like, if I don't preach the gospel, like my bones are on fire, or, something like that. Like I'm not doing this because people expect me to. I'm doing it because that's what I do. I have no choice. So you have no choice but to write.
It's, I think, I don't want to make it sound too biblical or anything like that, but that is what it feels like. I just, my mind would wander and make up stories, and I'd write them down, and I enjoy doing it. So.
Well, excellent. So how did that get over? 'Cause I've done a little bit of paid writing off and on, and I know how hard it can be to do that consistently. So how did you go from, I'm going to write no matter what because I enjoy writing, to, you got published, and then, you've gone from there. So how, I'm hoping that there's people that are hopeful writers listening to this that, may glean something from you.
I'm very fortunate. When I first got married, and you're doing a lot of stuff trying to get established, and in spite of all the stuff my wife and I are doing trying to get started, I'm still writing, and she didn't really see the value of that. So I caught some flack that maybe I should be doing something more productive with my time. But after a while of me being cantankerous and digging in, saying there's nothing I'd rather be doing with my time right now than writing, she came around, and a little bit before 2010, which comes up because of the Odyssey reference when you were reading off the Jim Breyfogle is thing earlier.
The Odyssey Writing Workshop.
Yes. She very pleasantly surprised me by saying, if you're going to do this, then why don't you be serious about it? Why don't you try and write? You seem to write good stuff. How about if you try and write good stuff for other people? And she encouraged me to be a little more serious about it, rather than just writing stories, to try and write stories that could be published, and to go to this Odyssey workshop, which, for the people who don't know, is a very intensive, it's a 6-week on-site course in New Hampshire, done by Gene Cavellis, who is a former editor, and I want to say Random House, but I probably shouldn't because I might be wrong there. But she was a very influential editor, and then decided that what she really wanted to do was help writers with the actual craft rather than the publication. So she started this course at St. Anselm's College in New Hampshire. It's a competitive sort of thing. And you, of course, have to submit some of your writing, and then she sort of evaluates if you have enough potential to be worth helping or not. So with my wife's support, I was admitted there and was able to take some of the things that she taught me and start writing a little more seriously, trying to write something that was good across the board rather than, oh yeah, I got a good character here, but the story is no good. I mean, juvenile writing kind of, you can tell juvenile writing. And I was able to maybe develop it a little bit beyond that, to start submitting to different places and selling some stories and things like that.
And you touch on something that I know a little bit of this because, like I said, I've done some. I've sold a little bit of fiction and nonfiction. Writing is so personal that a lot of writers, I think, don't make that leap to understanding that your writing will be better if you get help from people that will help your writing be better, and the need for like an editor and that sort of thing. And I think a lot of people don't make that. I mean, I've only really come to understand that over the past few years, how important it really is. That no matter how much you like your own writing, it can always be improved with help or, with workshops or with a good editor or something like that. So how competitive was this Odyssey Writing Workshop? Like how do you have any idea of like how many people apply versus how many people get in?
She is very, very closed about how many applications there are. She does not want people to, turn it into a bragging contest or anything like that. It is many hundreds of applications, and she's fluctuated with a number of people trying to find the appropriate class size, but it's generally between 12 and 16 will get in on any given year.
You said it lasted 6 weeks?
Last 6 weeks. It's it's pretty intense because you're doing a lot of writing, you're doing a lot of critiquing. She brings in some top flight writers. It's actually kind of funny, just as a side story, is the reason. So I had applied a couple years before I got in, and she gave me a very nice rejection letter and all that. And then I took a year off, and I applied again because I had not gotten in. I was kind of on their mailing list, and they're like, "Oh, the upcoming Odyssey class featuring George R.R. Martin as our guest speaker." And I'm like, I got to get in on that. I mean, who wouldn't want this? So I applied and I got in, and that year wasn't George R.R. Martin. And for some reason or other, one of the old flyers got put in the mail for me, and I would not have applied except for this flyer. And it was probably the best thing I could have done as a writer was to go to this workshop. And it was a very, very serendipitous mistake. And the person who sent out the mailings was like, I have no idea how that could have happened. It should not have been possible. And I'm like, I have no explanation either. I just know that I saw George R.R. Martin was going to be there. And I thought, what the heck? I'll give it a shot. The worst thing that can happen is I'll get rejected. And it worked out.
And in the back, there's Twilight Zone music in the background. So
yeah, exactly.
Let's talk a little bit about Mongoose and Meerkat. Right now, the second volume of collected Mongoose and Meerkat stories from CIRSOVA Magazine is on Kickstarter. Again, people can go to the show notes at shaneplays.com or search for Mongoose and Meerkat on Kickstarter, and you'll find it. But so here's a little bit more information. I think this might have been from the original Kickstarter was it 2020 for the first volume. Says he's a bit of a bravo, ready to knock a few heads for some coin. She's a mysterious wanderer with more than her share of street smarts and a head for ancient history. Together, the Mongoose and the Meerkat are a pair of rogues looking for coin to keep their bellies and wineskins filled, and are sure to appeal to fans of classic sword and sorcery. So this is going, if I had to elevator pitch Mongoose and Meerkat, and it's going to be wrong, so I'm purposefully throwing something wrong out there to give you, no, here's what it really is. I would say it's a little bit of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser if one of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser was a woman, so there was romance, that kind of tension, romantic tension, in addition to all the fun sword and sorcery adventures they get into. What is your response to that?
So there is some inspiration from Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. Fritz Leiber is an interesting writer. And of all of his stuff, and he won many awards, but in spite of the awards that he won, my favorite of his stuff is Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser.
I think most people's favorite is Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser.
Yeah, I mean, you can read Big Time and all that sort of stuff, but yeah, whatever.
I mean, and if people don't know, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser is sort of Bill and Ted type bromance, Wayne's World type bromance, but one of them is like a barbarian and the other one is like a more traditional like fantasy thief, and they have all kinds of great adventures together. Yes. And I don't want to slam on Lieber too much because, he's writing in a different time than we are. And he's a different person than I am. But Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser have some problems if you were to try and take them out of the 1950s and 60s and put them down in our time frame. Yeah, let me caveat this. Okay, so there is I'm just talking about the general setup of the stories. I mean, there's a lot of stuff from the quote unquote pulp era or older stuff that is, the problematic or what. I listened to the Appendix in book club podcast, and they probably spend 30 minutes each episode talking about, we have to look at this book in the lens of its own time. Right. By today's standards, there's problems. So I almost see that as a given, but we can take what's good and interesting out of the books, and discuss them. So yeah, there's definitely, I'm not implying that there's anything problematic or whatever. There isn't anything problematic. Yeah. So anyway, that's a little bit of, so what I've done with Mongoose and Meerkat, and obviously you just read kind of the intro for it, so I probably shouldn't delve too much into a description because you've covered it. Feel free to describe it as you would. No, that does a pretty good job of it. And that's early on because it is a series, and I don't want to give away the end of the direction of it, but just saying that tells people that there is an end. So I wrote it unlike Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, and there were some things that, as I started to write it and my writing developed as I went through the stories and added into it, it became more purposeful. And as it did that, it moved further away from the idea of, this is really a cool idea of having this sort of adventuring duo, which we haven't seen for a while. Maybe we can take that inspiration and rework it so it's a little bit more geared toward today's audience. And I went beyond that and said, okay, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser doesn't really have an end. They go from this to that to the other thing, and they could just keep doing it for infinity because there's really no purpose or drive. Right. It's just it's an ongoing series of bite-sized adventures. Exactly. What did Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser get up to today? Mongoose and Meerkat is not that. It looks like that at the beginning, and when you start off and you can read, so you can read the first story, and you can read the fifth story, and you can read the ninth story, and you don't have to read anything in between for you to have an entire story right there. You can pick it up for story number 7 and read number 7 and have not read anything before that and still understand the story and hopefully still think that was a great story to read. And then if you want to skip to 12, you can do that. If you want to read them out of order, you can do that. But if you read them in order, then you will see that there is actually a progression going on between the stories. And by the time you get to a certain point, then you realize that, maybe going back and rereading the stories and picking up stuff
not a bad idea.
Well, and you put in some, I think like the titles of volume 1 or volume 2 are pretty clever, because volume 1 includes the word pursuit, and volume 2 is talking about the heat of the chase. So in the midst of all these swords and sorcery adventures, there is a romantic layer, which I think is great, because I like it. I'm not saying they're the same. All right. I'm just, in general, when you can successfully add that layer to an adventure story, it makes it even that much better. I'm obviously thinking of like, some of the romances that were in Indiana Jones, or I'm romancing the stone, or the Mummy. The lead, the two lead characters in the Mummy was a great romantic tension. And of course, I always think about Sam and Diane, or Sam and I can't remember.
Cheers.
And Cheers. That added that romantic tension added so much. Even though Cheers is not an adventure story. So, so I'm assuming you purposefully wanted, or did that just sort of add on later? Or when did the romantic element come into it?
So it's an interesting thing, because I don't want to get to the end of it, and it's been very difficult not to, because now we're at the second book. The first book, I'm like, the end is way far away, and I don't need to worry about that. And now we're at the second book, and the end is a lot closer than we were before. So I can talk about the things that people may have read already from the stories in the magazine, but I don't want to give away too much of where they're going to go beyond that. And one of the things that is a mystery to Mongoose is that Kat is a very beautiful woman. And she should be desired by everybody who sees her, but she's not. And he can't quite figure out why, and she doesn't talk about it. So one of the things that the series is purposefully done, I did this on purpose because I wanted to limit the flow of information, if you will. It sounds a little cold-blooded, but it is what it is. This is in Mangos's point of view. So if Mangos doesn't know it, nobody knows it. The reader doesn't find out until he does. So you're limited a little bit on how curious he is, how smart he is, where he happens to be at the time. And some of this stuff, he just, either he doesn't know or he doesn't care yet. So yeah, the idea of romance, I wanted to have an idea that, you have these two people who are adventuring, and it's not the bromance. I did kind of want to expand the readership beyond just, 14-year-old boys or something like that. But I didn't want to bring it in too strongly or anything like that, because it's supposed to be more of an adventure. And if there's anything like that, it would be more flavoring rather than the main course. So I've actually kind of throttled it down from what it could be.
Well, I don't think that controlling, a job as a writer is determining what is the best window into the story and what is the best information to present to make the story not only the most enjoyable now, but for future payoffs that you have in mind to hit the way you want them to. So, yeah, I don't think that's cold-blooded at all. That's part of the writing process. But
every now and then you run into a reader who's like, "Oh, I need to know it now," and I'm like, "Be patient. Yeah. Be patient."
Yeah, well, that's a good problem to have if people are that into, what you're writing. And, you're talking about Mongoose and Cat. Again, Mongoose and Meerkat are their nicknames. So Mongoose is the guy and Cat is the woman, and they are adventuring through a swords and sorcery fantasy. So how many stories have you told so far, and how many are to come, since you have an ending in mind? Or do you even know that yet?
No, I do know that. It's been done. I haven't written a Mongoose and Meerkat tale for years, actually.
Okay.
Everything.
So you're okay.
It's been great working with Alex, because when we started this, I approached him with an idea, and he liked the idea, but somehow we sort of miscommunicated because I'm like, this is what I would like to pitch to you. And he says, that sounds great. Send me the first one. And so he read the first one and he liked the idea and he said, great, we'll do it. Let's go from there. And you can go back and you can sort of see that, the first Mongoose and Meerkat is in CIRSOVA number 6, I think it is. And then we take a break. And then the next one is, I think, number 8. And we got to the point further into the series that he's like, okay, we're far enough into the series that I kind of want to know, do you know where this is going? And I'm like, man, they're already written. I'm sorry,
Right.
I thought I made that clear. And he was like, really? Okay, well, tell me what's going on. Because at that point, they had gotten to the point where they had gotten over the hello, how you do's. They had sort of gotten enough experience that they were no longer failing at all their quests, and they're starting to get some stuff. And he's like, well, what are they going to do with this stuff? You've hinted at the idea that maybe there's a purpose to this, but when are we going to start to see that purpose realized? And so I sent him kind of a synopsis of where it was going. And at that point, he's like, you know what? I'll just buy them all. I'm like, okay.
Nice.
Yeah, I'm like, that's great. And
wow.
yeah. And so he's had them, and that's when they went to every issue gets a Mongoose and Meerkat, is after after we finally got the communication straight. And, I'm like, I'm sorry, I thought you knew they were already written. Of course I can tell you where it's going, because there are 18 of these stories. And to be perfectly honest, I'm sorry, I don't remember if we're at 12 or 13 or where we are that it's coming out right now.
And, in the final story, that's when they confront Thulsa Doom and his cult. And then, right. And so it's, let's think, they fight Thulsa Doom and Ming the Merciless. That's
something like that.
Everything
I think, maybe Darth Vader's in the background.
Yeah. Darth Vader shows up. Yeah. So what, I know it's like almost a cliche, but why did you write Mongoose and Meerkat? I know you said you wanted to kind of get away from just the standard bromance stuff, but was there any other inspirations there that led you to put that much time into writing?
One of them is, it was great fun to write. I mean, I love writing. I've already sort of said that, but so this format is really kind of unique. I mean, there are things that are like it, but I haven't come across anything that's exactly like it, that you have 18 separate stories that when you then put them all together, you can see that there's one story weaving through all of them. But unless you know that, you probably wouldn't see it. So the hope is that when people actually do get to the end of it, they will be encouraged to go back and reread the stories and enjoy them again, and then maybe appreciate them as they can take that ending knowledge and seeing how they got there with new eyes. But part of it also was, it provided me as an author the opportunity to do so many different things. I mean, so many times when you write a normally structured story, you have one geography, you have one plot, you have a cast of characters, and you have the minor characters, but the minor characters basically don't change because you're in one geography. And, when you have a world spanning thing, you have something that is epic, and that's great. But when you have 18 stories, I get to move them wherever I want to. I mean, they don't have to be in Alamar the whole time. They don't have to be on a tropical island. They don't have to be in a jungle, but they can be in all of those things. And I'm not tied to, I made the reference that some of them have a little bit of a tint of horror to them, a tint of mystery, a tint of steampunk. I'm not writing a steampunk story overall, but I can write one story that has steampunk elements in it, and that's kind of cool. It gives me a chance to sort of experiment with different structures. I've heard so many times that never do flashbacks. Flashbacks suck. They are never done right. They're always confusing. Just don't do them. Well, I wanted to try that, so I'm not gambling the farm on a flashback, but I do have one in one of the stories. Because of Mangos's story arc, and I've used this example several times in the past, is, he starts off and he's really inexperienced and he's illiterate, but you can see over the course of the whole thing that he learns to read. And by the time we get to the title of the story is Fight of Sandfishers, and it's going to be coming out in CIRSOVA shortly, it is written from the first person. It's the only one. We have 17 stories in third person, but we have one in first person. And the structure has allowed me to do stuff like that. And once I started, I started with this idea that I want to write an adventuring duo and I want to make it a little more accessible to modern audiences. And then I write another story and then I write another story and I say, hey, I can do this with it and turn it a little bit sideways and keep going. And then I can do that with it and turn it a little bit sideways the other way and keep going. And it just let me do a lot of stuff that was, enjoyable as an author to try and do and see how it turned out.
Since some people listening to this podcast might be coming into Mongoose and Meerkat sort of in the middle of the story, if you will, or it sounds like we actually might be in there and going into the third reel as far as the publication.
Yep.
So you did 2020, I think there was a Kickstarter for Tales of the Mongoose and Meerkat Volume 1. Do you know if that's still available?
It absolutely is. Okay, so here's a little bit of two-pronged shameless self-promotion. If you go to the Kickstarter that we're doing right now for Heat of the Chase, and you decide any version that you want to buy of Heat of the Chase, whether it is the digital version, whether it is the mass market paperback, the trade paper, or the hardcover, comes with a digital copy of Pursuit Without Asking. So right off the bat, if you wanted to jump in on the second book, you would get an electronic version of the first book for free. And that's a great way to get caught up.
And then of course, future issues of CIRSOVA Magazine are going to be printing. If I remember right, Alex is the publisher of CIRSOVA Magazine. I want to give him a shout out. He's doing a lot to keep the torch lit for this type of fiction, and I salute him.
He does good work with this.
Yeah, and he does it as, I know Alex. I bump into him sometimes. We talk, we chat. He does this because he loves it, but he also makes sure that, people get their fiction paid for, and that kind of thing. He doesn't just, hey, get my magazine and I'll give you a free copy or, something like that.
Yeah. And that's important. It really is. And it's understated because there's so much fiction out there that people are writing and trying to get published, and there are people who are perfectly willing to take your fiction and not pay you for it. I'm a big believer of, if this has value, you should get paid.
Right. Yeah. The thing is, you can't. It's snarky, but actually, I just went to a small publisher seminar recently for small game publishers like role playing games, and they were like, you get paid for your work. It's the common refrain that you can't pay your mortgage with exposure or contributor copies. So,
right.
If they're going to get value out of it by publishing it, that value should be passed to you. Yeah, I think the last time I've done a episode on CIRSOVA is when he was able to publish the posthumous collaboration on Tarzan.
Michael Tierney.
Yeah, Michael. Yeah, I was actually at the release day of that when they did, I think, Tarzan and the Mysterious She, where working with the estate, it's not working with the Edgar Rice Burroughs estate. Michael Tierney actually finished an unfinished short story of Tarzan, and CIRSOVA published it. So that was very cool. All right, so I got to start wrapping this up here. I did want to mention, just because I think the first volume Kickstarter mentioned that said something like, these are the sort of stories you could easily run for a tabletop RPG with just a few stat blocks. Said for a bit of extra fun, we'll be throwing in a couple of Mongoose and Meerkat character sheets as a bonus. Do you know if Volume 2 has anything like that going on?
It does. So it's one of the stretch goals. If we sell $3,000 worth through the Kickstarter, then that will be added in. right now, I don't want to jinx anything, but it's looking good. That's not something that. Oh, I'm sorry. I've just been told that we are over 3,000.
Oh yeah, let's take a look at the goal. You are currently at $3,032. Dun 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 dun. So
All right.
so you've hit that you've hit that stretch goal.
Excellent. So that means that there should be new character sheets for Mongoose and Cat, and there should be some new description and how to incorporate it into your tabletop role-playing game. I don't do that. That was all Alex. It's one of his ways that he wants to help drive sales. I have known that there are people who have used them as NPGs.
NPCs actually.
NPCs, yeah, sorry. The non-player character. And it honestly, from my point of view, it's just cool to see that. It's like having the illustrations, because these books are illustrated.
Well, I was about to bring that up. I love this art. It's very, very clean line art. Do you know who's doing your art here?
I don't know her personally. I know her name, but she goes by the artist name is Dark Philly.
Okay, I love the art on the Kickstarter page. It's very clean and crisp. But
yes,
you get right off the bat, you get what kind of fiction this is. So,
and it's really cool as an author when somebody like Alex does character sheets and you see how somebody else views your character or somebody like Dark Philly does illustrations, because, I have limited input on that, and that's pretty much all of them. And I'm really curious to see what Alex is going to do with the new character sheets, because I assume they're going to have leveled up by now, a little bit at least. So it'll be interesting to see how he interprets the characters at this point in the story arc. And, like the cover art is awesome, and the interior art is awesome. And I think people should be buying it for that alone. But again, it's just, I write these and I have a mental image. I mean, anybody who writes sees the story in their mind, but that doesn't necessarily come across well on the page. So to see how other people see the story, having read it rather than experienced it the way I did, is really cool. I mean, as an author, that's just really cool.
That is neat. And then I want to also mention that there's a stretch goal in here where you could potentially get an audiobook for volume 2. It just looks like there was an audiobook for volume 1, so that's exciting. So yes,
and that's I don't know how. Yeah, I mean the volume 1 audiobook is very cool. And to hear somebody else reading it, a professional who does this, and the person who did it, her cat voice is just spot on. I mean, she does a fantastic. She does a fantastic job with the whole thing, but the voice of Cat is just how you would picture Cat to talk. And one of the characters in Deathwater, also fantastic job. I'm just like, wow. So I obviously, I have a vested interest, but I hope we have enough interest in an audiobook to make it go. I know it's an awful lot of work for Alex, so he wanted to make sure that it would be worthwhile before we dove into that again.
All right, I got to wrap this up, man. Folks, we've been talking about Mongoose and Meerkat, Tales of the Mongoose and Meerkat, The Heat of the Chase. That'll be volume 2, collecting the second collection of adventures of Mongoose and Meerkat by Jim Breyfogle from CIRSOVA Magazine. It sounds great. Sword and sorcery, fun fiction. There's a undertone. There's an ongoing underlying story with a specific finish in mind. A little bit of mystery to figure out with Cat. Very interested with the Meerkat cat. This is great. I'm glad you're doing this. I'm glad that you and Alex have partnered up. So, is there any final thoughts before I take us to the bad joke of the week?
I can't think of anything. I appreciate your having me on, give me the opportunity to talk about writing, talk about Mongoose and Meerkat. I know I said that
glad to have you.
I know I said I'm a little bit of an introvert, but one way to kind of bring me out of my shell is to talk about writing a little bit. So I appreciate you giving me a chance to do so. Oh yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I love what you guys are doing with CIRSOVA. I know Alex is publishing CIRSOVA, but you've become a very prominent part of CIRSOVA with Mongoose and Meerkat. So, thank you. So, okay, here we go.
And I have to do this to you. I have to do it. I call it the bad joke of the week, even though I don't do a weekly podcast anymore. It's once or twice a month. But bad joke of the week just has a great ring to it. So here we go. Here we go, Jim. Why did the shark cross the reef?
Why did the shark cross the reef? I don't know. Why did the shark cross the reef?
Well, Jim, to get to the other tide.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. That's the correct response. Yeah, that kind of deep, visceral pain. Yes, sir. That primal, visceral.
That's not just a dad joke. That's a like dad of twins joke.
That's a bad joke, my friend. Yeah, dad of twins. No, that transcends dad joke, and we are into bad joke territory. So the worse, the better. Well, I'm glad you got to experience that psychic pain. I wish you nothing but success as you continue to work on Mongoose and Meerkat. And, I hope that, the Kickstarter has funded. Congratulations. So now it's just a matter of how much of it can you get out there, and you got a couple of, you hit one stretch goals with the character sheets for RPGs, and now we're looking at the audiobook stretch goal. But congratulations, that volume 2 will get out there, folks. You have till I think the end of June to support the Kickstarter, and again, you can go to the show notes at shaneplays.com, or go to CIRSOVA Magazine, search for CIRSOVA Magazine. I'm sure the link will be there, or just go to Kickstarter and search for Mongoose and Meerkat. But Jim, thanks again for coming on. Appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, and likewise. Thank you for coming on. It was my pleasure to have you. And everybody else, we will catch you next time on Shane Plays Geek Talk. Thanks so much for listening to Shane Plays Geek Talk. I certainly hope you enjoyed this journey into the things we love. For your convenience, show notes with helpful links for each episode can always be found at shaneplays.com. You can catch the podcast in several places, including on the blog at shaneplays.com, iTunes, Google Play Music, Stitcher, Podbean, Amazon Music, Verbal, YouTube, and more. If you like what you hear and would like to support Shane Plays Geek Talk, you can do so for as little as $1 per episode on Patreon at patreon.com/ShanePlays. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time. Stay geeky, my friends.